The bullet had been in Edwin Redmond's side for 3 days before Fannie Barrett found him half dead in the creek bed behind her property, and the moment she rolled him over and saw his face, pale as birch bark beneath a week's worth of stubble, she made a decision that would change the entire course of her life. It was the spring of 1878, and the Colorado Hill country was just beginning to shake off the last gray fingers of winter. The aspens along the ridgeline were tipped with a tender, almost heartbreaking green, and the creek that ran behind Fannie's modest homestead was running fast and cold with snowmelt. She had gone down to the water that Tuesday morning with a wooden bucket, and her mind full of the ordinary troubles that accompanied a woman living alone on 40 acres in the San Juan foothills. The fence posts that needed setting before the cattle got into the kitchen garden, the roof shingles that had loosened during March's brutal windstorms, the dwindling supply of cornmeal in the larder. She had not been thinking about strangers. She had certainly not been thinking about love. But then her boot struck something solid beneath the overhang of a cottonwood root, and when she knelt down expecting to find a deadfall log or perhaps a river stone of unusual size, she found instead the broad, limp shoulder of a man face down in the shallows. "Lord Almighty," she breathed and dropped the bucket. He was tall. Even unconscious and crumpled sideways into the mud, she could tell that much. His coat was the color of dark tobacco, soaked through and plastered to the width of his back, and his hat, a battered, once-fine Stetson, had come to rest in a pool of shallow water 6 inches from his outstretched hand. His dark hair was matted with creek water and something darker that Fannie recognized, with a cold twist of her stomach, as dried blood. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat and felt a pulse, faint and uneven, stuttering like a candle in a draught, but there. "All right then," she said aloud to herself, to the aspens, to no one in particular. "We are going to fix this." Fannie Barrett was 26 years old and had been running this homestead alone for 14 months, ever since her father Cletus Barrett had died of a stroke the winter before last. She was not a woman who panicked easily. She had delivered a calf in the dark with no one helping her but a lantern and her own 2 hands. She had put down a rattlesnake with a shovel handle when it got into the chicken coop. She had ridden 6 miles through a November blizzard to fetch the doctor for old Marta Wexler, the German widow who lived up the ridge, when Marta's heart started doing worrying things. She was capable. She was stubborn. And she was, beneath the practical calloused exterior that frontier life demanded of women who intended to survive it, possessed of an enormous and carefully guarded heart. She turned the man over first, getting mud on both her knees in the process and not caring a bit, and when his face came clear of the water she got her first real look at him. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 on either side of that. Square jaw, straight nose that had been broken at least once if the slight lean of it meant anything, dark brows, and beneath the pallor of blood loss and exposure, a face that in better circumstances she suspected would carry a certain serious, weathered handsomeness. His lips were faintly blue. The wound was in his right side below the ribs. It had been bleeding slowly and steadily for what looked like days, soaking through a bandage that someone, maybe the man himself, had attempted to press there from a torn shirt tail. The shirt itself was ruined. "You are not dying in my creek," Fannie told him firmly, and meant it as both a promise and a command. Getting him up the bank and across the 30 yards to her cabin door was the hardest physical labor she had performed in recent memory, and her recent memory included splitting a winter's worth of firewood. She wedged herself under his right arm, lifted with her legs, and half-dragged, half-walked him through the spring grass, stopping twice to rest when her own legs threatened to give out beneath the combined weight. He was heavy. He was, when she got him through the door and onto the rope bed in the back room that had been her father's, at least 6 feet of him, and not an ounce of that height was wasted on anything that wasn't bone and solid muscle. He did not wake up while she stripped the ruined coat and shirt from him, though he made a sound when she peeled the makeshift bandage away from the wound, a low, ragged sound from somewhere deep in his chest that made her whisper, "Easy, easy now. I am not going to hurt you any worse than you already are." The bullet, she could see immediately, had gone clean through. It had entered from the front at an angle and exited through the back, punching through the muscles of his flank without, as best she could tell, catching anything vital. That was luck enough to be counted as miraculous. But the wound had been open and dirty for too long, and the skin around it was hot to the touch and red in a way that made her jaw set with worry. She built the fire up high, set water to boiling, and went to her medicine cabinet, a modest but well-stocked affair that her father, a careful man, had maintained with the same diligence he'd applied to everything else on the property. She had carbolic acid, the use of which she'd learned about from Dr. Hayward in the valley town of Crestline, who was a progressive sort of physician and kept up with the newer European methods. She had clean linen bandaging, willow bark for fever, laudanum for pain, and a steady pair of hands. She cleaned the wound as carefully as she knew how, applying the carbolic solution while the unconscious man's body flinched and shuddered with each pass of the cloth. She packed it clean, wrapped it tight, and pressed her palm to his forehead, where the fever was already beginning to climb. "Who are you?" she murmured, half to herself. She looked at his face in the flickering firelight. Whatever his story was, it was not a simple one. The calluses on his hands were those of a working man, someone who had handled ropes and reins for years. There was a scar along his left forearm, old and white, that spoke of some past injury. At his right hip, the holster was still buckled, and the revolver in it, a fine Colt single-action army, she could see, the kind they were calling the Peacemaker, was clean and well-oiled even if its owner was not. She removed the gun belt, careful and deliberate, and hung it on the chair post within reach of the bed, in case he woke disoriented and grabbed for it. A man who kept a gun that clean was a man who knew how to use it, and she would rather he had it available to him than find him lunging for something that wasn't there. Then she sat down in the chair beside the bed, folded her hands in her lap, and settled in for the long work of keeping a stranger alive. The fever broke and returned and broke again over the next 4 days. During the worst of it, the man was delirious, muttering words that came and went like snatches of conversation she couldn't quite locate herself in. He said a name once, Caleb, with a raw urgency that made her think it was someone he was afraid for. He spoke about horses in a low and careful voice, as if giving instructions. Once, very briefly, he opened his eyes, looked directly at her and said with startling clarity, "The water's rising," before his eyes fell shut again and the fever pulled him back under. Fannie kept the fire steady and changed his bandages twice a day. She got willow bark tea into him in small sips, tilting his head forward and speaking to him in a quiet, even voice, the same voice she used with frightened animals. She told him about the fence posts that still needed setting, and the state of the aspens on the ridge, and about a peculiar cloud formation she had seen that morning that had looked remarkably like a running horse. She did not know if he could hear any of it. She told him anyway. On the 5th day, she walked into the room with a bowl of broth and found him awake, not delirious, not muttering. Awake and watching the door with a level, dark-eyed alertness that suggested whatever his condition might be doing to his body, it had not touched his mind. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She stood in the doorway with the bowl of broth, looking back at him, and felt the odd sensation of the world reorganizing itself slightly, as if the room had shifted 2 degrees on its axis. "You are going to want this," she said, and came in and set the bowl on the bedside table. "You have not eaten in 5 days. Your body needs the salt." He opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed carefully. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse and fever, a low baritone that needed a moment to find its footing. "Where am I?" "My homestead, about 4 miles northwest of Crestline in the foothills above the San Miguel Valley." She pulled the chair close and sat down. "You were in my creek, face down." He absorbed this. His eyes moved around the room with the careful, methodical attention of a man who assessed spaces for exits as a matter of habit. Then they came back to her. How long? 5 days. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. You pulled me out. I did, by yourself. There is no one else, she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the gun. On the chair post, she said, and nodded to it. I left it where you could reach it. I figured a man who keeps a weapon that well should probably have access to it. He looked at the chair post, and when he looked back at her, something in his expression had shifted, fractionally, toward something softer than the careful blankness he'd started with. That was good thinking, he said. I do a fair amount of it, Fannie replied, and handed him the broth. His name was Edwin Redmond, and she learned it in pieces over the next several days, the way you learn most things worth knowing, slowly, and in the spaces between other things. He was from Texas originally, raised on a cattle operation outside Abilene. He was 31 years old. He had been working as a cattle drover and sometime range detective for the past 8 years, following the herds north along the trails that crossed Kansas and Colorado, troubleshooting disputes, recovering stolen stock, doing the kind of work that required both a steady head and a willingness to go into difficult places when called upon. He had come up into the San Juan country, chasing 3 men who had run off with 200 head of longhorn cattle, belonging to a rancher named Aldous Pryor, a man whose lawyer had retained Edwin through a contact in Durango. He had caught up to 2 of the 3 men at a camp in the hills east of Crestline. The third had caught up to him first, from behind a boulder, with a rifle. Edwin had ridden for some number of hours after the shot before the blood loss and the fever and the sheer accumulated punishment of the wound had finally taken him down from his horse in the creek bed. What happened to your horse? Fannie asked one evening, 3 days after he had first woken. She was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in one of her work shirts by lamplight, and Edwin was propped up in the bed with more color in his face than he'd had when she'd found him, though still pale enough to worry her when she let herself think about it. Roan gelding, he said. He was quiet a moment. He would have made for water. He is probably grazing somewhere downstream. I'll look for him tomorrow, she said. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of surprise, a very contained, very reserved version, just a slight deepening of attention in his eyes. You don't have to do that. I know I do not have to, she said, without looking up from her mending. I am offering. She found the horse the following morning, a quarter-mile downstream, standing in the shallows and looking reproachful, the saddlebag still strapped to his back and intact. She led him up to the paddock, rubbed him down, and gave him a measure of oats, and when she came back in to report this to Edwin, she found him sitting up straighter than he had managed before, a look of relief on his face that was, she thought, one of the most honest things she had yet seen from him. Reckless, he said of the horse. That is what you named him. It seemed appropriate at the time. A pause. He is all right. He is eating your horse's weight in my oats, she said, and looking entirely self-satisfied about it. The laugh that came out of Edwin Redmond was not a loud thing, but it was genuine, startled out of him, and it transformed his face in a way that made Fannie's hands forget what they were doing for just a moment before she collected herself. Over the following week, Edwin mended steadily. The infection retreated before the vigilant application of carbolic and clean linen, and the wound began to close with the healthy, grudging resilience of a strong man's body doing what it was built to do. He was not an easy patient in the way that some men are easy patients. He was never querulous or demanding, never dramatic about his discomfort. But he was fiercely resistant to being confined to the bed longer than he considered necessary, and on the 8th day after he had woken, she came in from the morning chores to find him standing at the window, fully dressed and upright, with one hand braced against the wall and a look of grim determination on his face that suggested he had been standing there approximately long enough to sincerely regret the decision. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Standing," he said. "I can see that." The question was more philosophical. He turned his head and looked at her, and a slight color came into his face that she didn't think was entirely attributable to the exertion. "I am not accustomed to being useless," he said. "You were shot," she pointed out. "That generally provides a reasonable excuse." "I have been in your bed for the better part of 2 weeks," he said. "I have eaten your food and used your medicine and slept under your roof. I would like to be able to at least stand without assistance." She crossed the room, went to his free side, and without making a ceremony of it, put his arm across her shoulders. "Then stand," she said, "with assistance. And in 4 more days, when the wound has had time to set properly, you can stand without it." He looked down at her. She was not a small woman, but he had 7 inches on her at minimum, and she could feel the effort it was taking him to hold himself upright, the slight tremor in the arm she was supporting. But she could also feel the warmth of him, the solid reality of him, in a way that moved through her chest with a warmth of its own that she was not entirely prepared for. "You are very direct," he said. "It saves time," she said. "I appreciate it," he said, and from the weight in his voice she believed him entirely. Those evenings became the part of the day she found herself thinking ahead to with a quiet, private attention that she recognized, if she was honest with herself, as something more than ordinary neighborly feeling. Edwin, as he grew stronger, became a different kind of presence in her house. He spoke more, though never loosely. He had a way of choosing his words with the care of a man who knew their weight. He asked her questions about the property, about her father, about how she had come to be running 40 acres alone, and he listened to the answers with a completeness of attention that she was not used to from men, who in her experience tended to listen to women with one ear and wait out the parts that didn't directly pertain to them. She told him about her father, and about the homestead, and about what it had taken to keep it together after his death. She told him about the neighbors, what few she had, and about the town of Treeline down in the valley, and about the particular quality of the light in these hills in the late afternoon, when it came sideways through the aspens and turned everything the color of old honey. She told him about the book she was in the middle of, a battered copy of David Copperfield that had been her mother's, and he surprised her by knowing it well, by having read it himself 3 times, by having opinions about it that were thoughtful and specific, and not at all what she might have predicted from a Texas cattle drover with a colt on his hip. "Where did you find time to read Dickens?" she asked one evening, laughing. "Cattle drives are long," he said, "and there are a lot of hours on a bedroll under a sky that has already told you everything it is going to tell you that night." He looked at the fire. "My mother sent me a crate of books when I was 19 before I went out on the first drive. I read every one of them twice." "What else was in the crate?" He was quiet a moment. "Thackeray, George Eliot, a Bible which I have read considerably less than the others, and a very long novel by a Russian whose name I could never correctly pronounce, about a man who keeps making bad choices and suffering beautifully for them." Fanny laughed, and the laugh filled the room, and Edwin looked at her with that particular expression that was becoming familiar to her, the one that looked like a man discovering, slowly, and with some surprise, that the ground under his feet is more interesting than he had initially taken it for. He was up and moving carefully around the property by the 2nd week. He fixed the fence post she had been meaning to get to since February, working with a methodical steadiness that she watched from the kitchen window while she was pretending to do other things. He repaired 2 of the loose shingles on the roof. He mended a broken spoke in the wheel of her farm wagon, and then, because he was there and had the tools out, fixed 2 other spokes that had not quite broken yet but were heading that direction. He did these things without announcing them, without waiting for her approval. He simply saw what needed doing and did it. And when she came out and found the fence posts set perfectly straight in the afternoon, she stood and looked at them for a long moment with her hands on her hips and felt something warm and complicated moving through her that she was having increasing difficulty classifying as simple gratitude. One evening, about 2 weeks and 3 days after she had found him in the creek, they ate supper together at the kitchen table, and the comfortable quiet that had developed between them was so natural, so lacking in the awkwardness that ought by rights to have existed between a woman and a man who had been strangers 18 days ago, that it gave her pause when she thought about it later. She had made venison stew, using the last of the dried venison from her father's hunt the previous fall, stretched with root vegetables from the cellar. It was good, and it was warm, and outside the April evening was cooling fast toward a night that would still carry genuine cold at this altitude. Edwin ate with an appreciation that was evident without being performed, the way hungry people eat when they have relearned the pleasure of it after days without. "Fannie," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was something she had been quietly getting used to without noticing when it had started. He used it simply and directly, the way he used words in general, without decoration. "What?" she said. He looked across the table at her, and his expression had that weight to it again. The particular gravity she had learned meant he was about to say something that mattered to him. "I am going to need to go back to Crestline," he said. "There is a man there who still has 160 head of cattle that belonged to Aldous Pryor, and a job I was retained to finish." Something in her chest went very still. She held the stillness carefully, not allowing anything to show on her face that she didn't want showing. "I know," she said. "You are well enough." "I wanted to," he stopped, which was unusual because Edwin Redmond was not a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. He looked at his hands on the table, then back up at her. "I want you to know that what you did, what you gave, that is not something a man forgets, not something I will forget." "You would have done the same," she said. "I would like to think so," he said, "though I am not certain I could have managed it half so well as you did." She smiled, though it cost her something she couldn't quite name. "When do you plan to go?" "Day after tomorrow," he said. "To give the wound another day." She nodded. "That is sensible." She was sensible about it for the remainder of that evening, and she was sensible about it through the next day, while he finished the last of the small repairs he had taken on, and was sensible about it through the following morning, when she packed him a supply of the carbolic-soaked dressing material and showed him how to change the bandage himself. She was sensible when she gave him directions to Dr. Hayward's office in Crestline, with instructions that he was to present himself there within 2 days of his arrival and have the wound properly examined by someone with a medical degree. He saddled Reckless himself, though slowly. Then he turned and looked at her, standing in the morning sunlight at the edge of the paddock with her arms crossed over her chest and her dark hair coming loose from its braid in the spring wind. She looked at him and made herself smile, clear and uncomplicated. "Take care of that side," she said. "I will." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought he was going to say something more, something beyond the ordinary words of departure, something that might belong in the space she had been very carefully not examining for 2 weeks. But he pressed his lips together and adjusted his hat and said, "Thank you, Fannie Barrett, for everything." "Ride safe, Edwin Redmond," she said. And she stood there and watched him ride down the hill, the roan gelding picking his way carefully through the spring grass. And she stood there until she could no longer distinguish the dark shape of him against the aspens on the lower slope. And then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood surface and breathed for a while. She told herself she felt nothing complicated. She told herself this for approximately 4 days, which was about as long as self-deception of that particular variety can sustain itself in a clear-headed woman. By the end of the first week, the house felt different. Not emptier exactly, because it had always been hers and she had always been content in it, but altered somehow, as if the walls had learned to accommodate the presence of a particular person and were now registering his absence with a faint, persistent note she hadn't heard before. She caught herself, more than once, thinking about something she wanted to tell him, a particularly fine sunrise, the sound of the creek running fuller than usual, a funny thing her old dog Gus did with the chicken coop latch, and reaching the end of the thought with nowhere to put it. She set her jaw and put those things somewhere useful and got on with the fence and the oats and the kitchen garden, which needed its first good weeding of the season. She went to Crestline twice in the following weeks, for supplies, and both times she found herself noting the locations of the town's two saloons, the general store, and Dr. Hayward's office with a peripheral attention she would have described to anyone who asked as simple situational awareness. She was not looking for a tall man on a roan gelding. She was not. She did hear about him once. Connie Greer, who ran the millinery shop on the main street and knew everything that happened in Crestline within approximately 12 hours of its happening, mentioned over a bolt of calico that a range detective had recovered a large herd of stolen cattle from the hills northeast of town some 3 weeks back, and that there had been an altercation with the remaining cattle thief that had resulted in the latter being taken to Durango by the county sheriff, and the former riding out of town shortly thereafter. Tall fellow, Connie said, dark-haired, Texas by the sound of him, quiet type. She looked at Fannie with the bright, assessing eyes of a woman who traded as much in information as in hats. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Fannie? I run a homestead in the hills, Fannie said evenly. I do not keep track of the comings and goings of cattle detectives. Of course you don't, said Connie, who clearly believed not a word of this and measured out the calico. The weeks settled into a pattern. May arrived and the hills above Crestline went green and extravagant with new grass, and Fannie's garden came up properly, and she had a calf born to her one remaining cow, a heifer calf with absurdly long legs and a combative personality that she named Trouble, which seemed fair. She repaired the remaining damaged shingles herself, having watched how Edwin had done the others. She read the Dickens and then began on an old copy of Middlemarch that she had been meaning to read for 2 years and found herself finding in it certain passages that she read slowly and then sat with for longer than was probably necessary. She did not hear from Edwin Redmond. She had not expected to hear from Edwin Redmond. There was no logical reason why she should hear from Edwin Redmond. He was a range detective from Texas with a job finished and a trail to follow, and she was a homesteader 4 miles from a small town in the Colorado hills, and they had known each other for not quite 3 weeks under circumstances that were extraordinary and therefore probably not reliable as a gauge of ordinary connection. She was quite certain of all of this. She was so certain of it that she only thought about it approximately 4 times a day, which she considered an improvement over the first 2 weeks. June came, warm and generous, and with it came her neighbor Holt Winfield, who ran the largest cattle operation in the valley and who had, over the past year, developed a habit of stopping by Fannie's homestead once or twice a month with what he described as neighborly intent, and what she recognized as something rather more directional than that. Holt was a decent man. He was 43, a widower, prosperous and reasonably kind. He had made his interest in the possibility of a different arrangement between them clear enough, if not in so many words, in the way that men of his type tended to make things clear, through the steady accumulation of helpful actions and significant looks. In late June, sitting in the chairs on her porch after supper, she had felt obliged to invite him for supper. He had arrived close enough to the hour of it, he said, with the bluntness of a practical man finally electing to be practical. Fannie, you must know what I am going to say. I have a good idea, she said. This property is too much for one woman, he said. I am not saying anything against your capability. You are the most capable woman in this county and everyone knows it. What I am saying is that the scale of it alone is more than is fair to ask of any single person, and I am a man in a position to offer a very comfortable life. I think we suit well enough. I think we could be good partners. Fannie looked at the aspens on the ridge for a long while before she answered. Holt, she said carefully, you are a good man, I mean that without qualification. But, he said, but I am not in a position to say yes to you, she said, and I do not think I will be in that position. I am sorry because you deserve a direct answer and that is the most direct one I am able to give you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a dignity she respected him for, Is there someone else? Fanny opened her mouth to say no. There was no one else. There was a range detective from Texas who had spent 3 weeks in her back bedroom and then ridden away and not written a word in 8 weeks, and that was the entirety of it. And the word no was fully formed on her lips when the sound of hoofbeats on the lower track reached them both, and they both looked down toward the tree line. The roan gelding came out of the aspens at an easy walk. The man on his back sat straight in the saddle despite being the kind of tired that was visible from 50 yards, and his dark hat was pulled forward against the late June sun, and his coat was the color of dark tobacco. Fanny was on her feet before she had decided to stand up. Edwin Redmond reined reckless in at the edge of the yard and looked up at the porch, and his eyes found Fanny first, and then moved to the man beside her chair, and something in his expression arranged itself with a careful stillness that she recognized now as the thing his face did when he was controlling what it was allowed to show. "Fanny," he said. His voice was just as she remembered it. Low, steady, particular. "Edwin," she said. And then, because Holt was standing there and she was the only one present who understood the full weight of the moment, she said, "Come up. You look like you have been riding." 3 days, he said, and swung down from the horse with a careful deliberateness that told her the old wound still had opinions about certain movements. He came up onto the porch and he and Holt Winfield took each other's measure in the efficient, wordless way that men sometimes do, and Holt, who was not an unintelligent man, looked from one of them to the other and made his decision quickly. "I will be heading back," Holt said. He picked up his hat from where it rested on the porch rail and nodded to Fanny. "Good evening. You know where I stand." He looked at Edwin with a nod that was not unfriendly. "Evening." "Evening," Edwin said. Holt went to his horse and rode off down the track without looking back, and Fanny watched him go with a complex mixture of feelings that was mainly made up of an odd relief. Then she turned and looked at Edwin, who was standing on her porch in the long golden light of a June evening, and he looked back at her and he said, "I am sorry I did not write." "You had a job to finish," she said. "That is not why I didn't write," he said. He took his hat off, which he did rarely, and held it in both hands. Without it, he looked somewhat less like a formal frontier figure and more like a man who was working up to saying something difficult. "I didn't write because I have been trying to figure out what I was going to do about this for 8 weeks. "About what, specifically?" she asked. She kept her voice steady. She was a steady woman. He looked at her directly, the way he had looked at everything directly from the first moment he had come out of the fever and found her sitting in the chair beside his bed. "About the fact that I left here 8 weeks ago," he said, "and have not spent a single day of those 8 weeks not thinking about coming back." The June wind moved through the aspens on the ridge, a long, slow sighing sound, and the light was going warm and honeyed the way it did in these hills at this hour, and Fanny stood very still. "You are going to need to say that in plain language," she said, "because I have been telling myself a great many sensible and logical things for the past 2 months, and I would prefer not to misunderstand you." Edwin Redmond looked at her, and a slow and luminous thing happened to his face, the kind of smile that a person only produces when something deeply true is getting said out loud for the first time. "Plain language," he said. "I came back because of you, Fanny, not to finish a job. Not to pass through, because of you, because I would very much like to know if there is something here worth staying for." She let a breath out that she had been holding for some considerable time. "Edwin Redmond," she said, "I pulled you face first out of a creek and kept you alive for 3 weeks and watched you ride away, and I have been entirely unbothered by it ever since." "Entirely," he said. "Completely," she said. He laughed, and it was the same laugh she remembered, startled and genuine and entirely transforming, and she stepped off the porch step and closed the distance between them and said, much more quietly, "I am very glad you came back." He put his free hand against the side of her face, warm and careful, and looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him, the whole careful wall of reserve simply absent, replaced by something honest and tender and entirely him. "I am very glad I came back too," he said. They stood there in the warm June evening for a long moment, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him, the reality of him, the particular and irreplaceable presence of this specific man. And the thing that had been moving quietly through her chest for 8 weeks settled and clarified into something she was no longer interested in arguing with. She made supper, and he ate it the way he had eaten her food from the first time she'd gotten a bowl of broth into him when he was barely able to hold his head up, with honest appreciation and without ceremony. And they talked for 3 hours at the kitchen table, making up for 8 weeks of silence. He told her about the work in Durango, about the disposition of the case, about the long ride back up from the south that he had pushed too fast because he had made his decision and wanted to be done waiting. She told him about the garden and Trouble the calf and the middle mark and the passage she'd found that had made her sit still for half an hour. "Read it to me," he said. She went and got the book and found the passage and read it aloud, there at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That is exactly right," in a tone that told her he meant something particular by it, and she looked at him across the lamp and thought that she had found something unexpected and true, and that she was going to hold on to it with both hands. He did not leave. He asked her the following morning if there was work on the property that needed doing, and she said yes. There was always work, and he said, then he would like to stay and do it if she would have him, and they looked at each other with the clear-eyed practicality of two sensible people being honest about a situation, and she said yes. He set up a bedroll in the barn, which was proper, and she did not argue with it, which was also proper, though old Gus the dog immediately abandoned his spot by the fire and took up residence in the barn doorway as if to make his own position on the matter clear. The days that followed were the best days Fannie could remember in a long time. Edwin worked alongside her in the natural, unhurried way of a man who knew how to work, who found satisfaction in useful effort, who did not need to be directed or praised for it. They fell into a rhythm together that was remarkably easy, considering they were still, in the technical sense, two people who had known each other for a short time. He cut hay while she worked the garden. She cooked while he mended the paddock fence. They argued once about the best method of treating a sick calf, a genuine argument with raised voices and strong opinions that ended when it turned out she was right, and he acknowledged it without any of the bristling defensiveness that would have been unforgivable, and that made her trust him more, not less. One evening he asked her what she wanted, not in general, specifically, for this land, for this life, for herself. And she told him the truth, because he was a man who appreciated truth, that she wanted to expand the cattle operation, that she had her eye on the 20 acres adjacent that old Perkins was likely to sell, that she wanted to get a decent bull and build up a herd worth speaking of, that she wanted to put a proper porch across the whole front of the house, because the afternoon sun deserved a better place to be appreciated from. He listened, and when she finished he said, "The 20 acres is a good idea. The soil in that section runs deep, good grass." "You rode through it?" she asked. "On the way up," he said. "I was paying attention." She shook her head, but she was smiling. "You were already making plans." He looked at her with that particular steadiness. "I was thinking ahead," he said. "There is a difference." It was in July, on a particularly warm evening when they had been sitting on the porch watching the last of the light leave the ridge, that Edwin was quiet for a long stretch and then said without preamble, "I need to ride to Durango." Fannie looked at him. "I need to collect what is owed from the prior job," he said. "And there is a man there I need to speak to about a land deed, and a jeweler." She went very still. "A jeweler," she said. "I have something I need to arrange," he said, in the careful voice of a man who is attempting to be oblique and is not particularly good at it. "Edwin," she said. "I will be back inside of 10 days, he said. She looked at the ridge where the aspens were darkening against the last of the sunset. She breathed. She kept her expression composed, though it required genuine effort. "All right," she said. He left the next morning, And this time she watched him go with a different quality of feeling than the first time, a feeling that had a bottom to it. That was not the hollow thing she'd felt in April, but something that held its shape, even as the roan gelding disappeared into the tree line. She waited. She was very good at waiting. She tended the garden and fed the stock and wrote a letter to her cousin in Denver that she had been meaning to write since February, and read the second half of Middlemark, and had a long and one-sided conversation with Trouble the calf about patience. He was back in 8 days. He came back on a Thursday, the afternoon light strong and level across the hills, and she was in the kitchen garden when she heard the hoofbeats, and she made herself finish tying up the bean vine she had been attending to before she straightened up and wiped her hands on her apron and looked down the track. He came through the aspens at a canter, which was faster than he usually rode up the hill, and when he saw her in the garden, he brought Reckless down to a walk and came around to the garden gate and got down, and he was still dusty from the road, but his eyes were clear and bright in a way that made something in her chest start up a fast, steady percussion. He opened the garden gate and came through it, and stood in front of her among the bean vines and the new potato mounds, and the patch of late-spring lavender that she had coaxed through its third Colorado winter, and he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a small cloth pouch that had clearly come from a jeweler, cinched with a cord. He stood there looking at her with that unguarded, honest expression, the whole remarkable absence of his usual careful wall, and he said, "Fannie, I am not a man who finds it easy to say the big things. You have probably noticed that." "I have noticed that," she said. "I am going to try anyway," he said. "You found me in a creek and you kept me alive, and you did it with a competence and a steadiness, and a generosity that I have never encountered from anyone, in any circumstance, and somewhere in the middle of those 3 weeks, I understood that you were the most extraordinary person I had ever met. And then I rode away, which was one of the less intelligent things I have done in my life, and I spent 8 weeks learning that lesson properly. And when I came back and found you on that porch, and you looked at me, I knew that whatever I needed to arrange in myself to deserve being the man in your life, I needed to arrange it and stop wasting either of our time." Fannie stood among the bean vines with her hands folded in front of her apron and felt the whole long summer and the long, complicated spring before it settle and sort itself into this clear, warm, specific moment. "Edwin," she said, "you are doing fine at the big things." He opened the cloth pouch and took out a ring. It was simple and beautiful, a fine gold band set with a small, deep green stone that caught the afternoon light with a quiet intensity, and she looked at it and then at him, and felt something large and warm and unassailable move through her entire chest. "Fannie Barrett," he said, "I would like very much to spend my life on this land with you if you will have me. To be whatever you need me to be, and to have you beside me, and to make something real and lasting and worth having. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long-held moment. At his face, which she had first seen pale and unconscious in a creek bed and had come to know in all its expressions, the careful reserve and the startled laughter and the rare, full openness he offered in the moments that mattered most. At his hands, which had fixed her fence posts and mended her wagon wheel and changed his own bandages and done 1,000 small, useful, honorable things. At the ring, which was not extravagant but was chosen, specifically chosen, the green of the stone the exact shade of the aspens in new leaf. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Edwin Redmond." He put the ring on her finger, and then he stood there for a moment with her hand in both of his, and then he did something that she thought was possibly the most honest thing she had ever seen a grown man do. He pressed his forehead briefly down against her hand, just for a moment, the way a person does when relief and joy are the same feeling, and neither can be appropriately contained. Then he straightened up and looked at her, and she stepped forward and put her arms around him, careful of his side even now by habit, though the wound had been well and truly healed for months, and he held her with a careful, sure strength that had always made her feel, paradoxically, more like herself and not less. "I should warn you," she said into the fabric of his coat, "that I have very specific plans for this property, and I intend to be in charge of most of them." She felt the rumble of his laugh against her cheek. "I am fully aware of that," he said. "I am counting on it." They were married in Crestline on a Saturday morning in August, in the small whitewashed church on the main street that served the valley's modest congregation. Fannie wore a dress that she had made herself, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, with white buttons down the back that she had spent 2 evenings carefully sewing on, and she carried a handful of wildflowers from the hillside behind the homestead, because she liked them better than anything a garden could offer. Edwin wore a clean coat and a new collar, and had clearly made an effort with his hair that she found enormously endearing and said nothing about. There were about 20 people in the church. The few neighbors they had, Dr. Hayward, Connie Greer, who wept with the practiced enthusiasm of a woman who had been hoping this would happen, and felt personally responsible for the outcome in a way that was only partly delusional, and old Marta Wexler, who came down from her ridge in a wagon driven by her grandson and sat in the front row, and nodded approvingly throughout the proceedings as though she were grading them. Holt Winfield sent a letter of congratulations that Fannie thought was gracious, and meant it. The minister, a lean, careful man named Reverend Adler, read the vows, and they both spoke them clearly and directly, looking at each other with the full attention that had characterized them both from the beginning. When Edwin said, "I will," his voice was steady and sure, and carried the weight of someone who has considered every word and chosen them all deliberately. When Fannie said, "I will," her voice was clear and warm and without a trace of uncertainty. Afterward, back at the homestead, they had a supper that Fannie had prepared the day before, spread out on tables in the yard under a late August sky that was the kind of blue that makes you feel the world is briefly as good as it could possibly be. And there was music from a fiddle player from town, and people danced in the grass. And Edwin, who had warned her that he was not a natural dancer, danced with her anyway and was better at it than he'd let on. Which she told him, and which made him look pleased with himself in a way he tried to moderate. Life after the wedding fell into patterns that were entirely their own, built from 2 people who knew how to work and thought and care for things and were willing, with great honesty and some occasional stubbornness, to keep building them together. Edwin rode out on cattle work periodically. There were always ranchers who needed reliable men to track stolen stock or resolve range disputes, and the work paid well, but Crestline and the Hill homestead were now his fixed point, the place he rode toward rather than away from, and the difference in his bearing when he was doing the one rather than the other was visible to anyone who paid attention. They bought the adjacent 20 acres from old Perkins in September, exactly as Fannie had planned. They spent the fall building up the herd, acquiring a good Hereford bull that Edwin drove up from a ranch south of Durango, a transaction that required several days of negotiation and a great deal of patience, and which resulted in a fine animal that Fannie named Solomon, and that Edwin thought was a slightly ironic choice, but did not argue with. The work of 2 was different from the work of 1, in ways that went deeper than the simple arithmetic of doubled labor. It was the way problems halved when shared, the way plans became more ambitious because they no longer had to fit inside one person's capacity, the way the evenings were different fully, richly, warmly different from anything she had known in the long months of managing alone. Edwin was not a demonstrative man by nature, but he was a tender one, in the quiet ways that tend to outlast the louder varieties. He remembered the things she told him. He brought her coffee in the mornings before she asked for it. He noticed when she was tired and said so rather than waiting for her to announce it. When she was worried about something, he did not immediately try to solve it. He listened first fully and let her find her own way to the solution, offering his own thoughts when she asked for them and not before. These were not small things. These were, she thought, some of the largest things. She, for her part, had learned his particular rhythms. The way his silences were not absence but presence of a different kind. The way his humor was dry and infrequent enough that, when it appeared, it was worth paying attention to. The way he needed, occasionally, to be on his own on the ridge with nothing but the horse and the sky, and the way he was always, without fail, himself again when he came back from it. They argued. Properly, occasionally, with the full engagement of two strong-willed people who both thought they were right and were each sometimes correct. They argued about the cattle and the fencing strategy and the appropriate level of risk in extending credit to a neighbor for a sale, and once about David Copperfield in a discussion that became remarkably heated for something about a Victorian novel. They argued with the directness they'd both always used, and they resolved the arguments, always, because neither of them was interested in carrying things forward that could be set down, and because they had agreed early, without making a ceremony of it, that the land between two people ought to be kept clear of things that could grow and obstruct. Winter came to the hill country with its particular beauty and severity, snow deep in the high passes and the creek freezing over at the edges, the aspens silver-white against a sky so blue it seemed almost aggressive. Edwin cut the winter's firewood with a thoroughness that pleased her enormously, and that she did not tell him was partly why she had fallen in love with him, because she suspected he would find this funny in a way that she was not entirely in the mood to encourage. They spent the long evenings reading, alternating books and sometimes reading aloud to each other, a practice that had started naturally one November evening and continued, because it was one of the finest ways she knew to spend an hour. In the deep cold of January, Edwin came in from the barn one evening with his coat powdered in snow, and his face carrying an expression she recognized as the one he used when he was trying to calibrate how to introduce something. "What is it?" she asked. "Solomon," he said, "has been busy." She stared at him. Which of them, she had been half wondering for weeks. "Elsa and Bella both," he said, "spring calves." She put her hands on her hips and felt a surge of satisfaction so strong it was almost indistinguishable from joy. "That is excellent news," she said. "That is the beginning of a real herd." "It is," he said, and his expression matched hers entirely, the same satisfaction and the same pleasure in the particular thing they were building here on this specific piece of ground. Spring came back to the hills like a returning friend. The aspens went green again in their delicate, astonishing way. The creek ran fast and high with snowmelt, and Fanny stood at the kitchen window one Tuesday morning in April and looked at the place where the creek bent below the cottonwood roots and thought about that morning, exactly 1 year ago, when she had walked down to the water with a bucket and found a stranger face down in the shallows. She was still standing there when Edwin came in from the morning feeding, shedding his coat and bending to scratch Gus behind the ears before straightening and looking at her expression. He crossed the kitchen and came to stand beside her at the window, following her gaze to the creek bend. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. 1 year, she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking down at the water below the cottonwoods. "A year ago you were deciding whether to leave me in the creek," he said. "I never considered leaving you in the creek," she said. "I know," he said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into the warmth of him and they stood there together looking down at the water. "I am glad the creek is on your property and not on someone else's," he said. "That is a very romantic sentiment," she said. "I am a very romantic person," he said, with the perfect straightness of face that meant he was being both funny and, in his way, completely sincere. She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the spring hills, the aspens, the wide pale sky above the ridge, and felt something so large and quiet and complete that she almost could not hold all of it at once. A month later, she told him what she had begun to suspect, and what Dr. Hayward had confirmed on a Thursday afternoon in late May. She told him in the evening. On the porch she'd finally gotten built. Edwin and a hired hand from town had put it across the full front of the house in October, exactly as she'd wanted, with the last of the sunset doing its honeyed work on the aspens, which was, she was beginning to think, the light that belonged to the significant moments of her life. "Edwin," she said. He looked at her, and something in the way she said it made him set down the coffee cup and give her his full attention. "We are going to have a child," she said. The silence that followed was brief and full. She watched his face move through something she could not entirely describe, a sequence of things, surprise and then a rapid, deep going inward, and then back out again into an expression that was the most open she had ever seen from him, something so unguarded and enormous that it seemed almost too big for his face to hold. He reached across and took her hand and held it firmly, both of his covering hers, and he looked at her with eyes that were bright in a way she was not going to make a ceremony of noticing because she respected him too much. "A child," he said, as if he was learning the weight of the word. "Due in December," she said. "Doctor." Hayward seemed confident and entirely cheerful about it. Edwin Redmond breathed out a long, slow breath and looked at the aspens on the ridge and then back at her, and he said, in a voice that was steady in the way that things are steady when they are also very moved, "Fanny, this hill of yours has given me more than I knew how to ask for." "Our hill," she said. "Our hill," he said. The pregnancy moved through the summer with the same stubborn vitality that characterized Fanny in all things, and she refused to be limited by it in any way that was not strictly medically necessary, which led to a series of calm and measured conversations with Edwin about the appropriate level of heavy labor for a pregnant woman in her 3rd month, her 5th month, and her 7th month, each of which she won by pointing to Dr. Hayward, who was of the progressive opinion that moderate work was not a hardship and was in fact beneficial, and each of which Edwin accepted with the grace of a man who has learned that, on this particular category of things, his wife's judgment and her doctor's are more reliable than his own concern. He did, however, without making a word of it, quietly begin doing the heavier lifting, the hay bales and the water troughs and the fence post setting, in ways that she pretended not to notice because they both understood the arrangement and found it acceptable. Their son was born on a cold December night, with the snow coming down outside and Dr. Hayward present and competent, and Edwin present and considerably less so, managing to remain in the room because Fanny had told him firmly that she wanted him there, and he would not fail her, but spending a significant portion of the proceeding looking as though he deeply regretted every choice that had led him to this particular moment. When it was done and Dr. Hayward put the child in his arms, something happened to Edwin Redmond's face that Fanny, half exhausted and entirely triumphant in her bed, watched and knew she would remember for the rest of her life. They named him Samuel for Edwin's father, and he had dark hair and extremely emphatic opinions from the first hours, which Fanny considered entirely fitting. Samuel Barrett Redmond grew into a boy of considerable personality, and his parents combined stubbornness, which made for a childhood that was lively. He rode a horse before he was 5, because it was 1882 in the Colorado hills, and that was simply what children did, and he could handle a ranch dog by 6, and was helping with the morning feeding in a meaningful way by 7. And had opinions about the cattle operation by 8 that were occasionally correct, and always delivered with the conviction of someone who does not yet know enough to doubt themselves. 2 years after Samuel, there came a daughter. They named her Clara for Fanny's mother, and she arrived in a spring that was remarkably similar to the one that had started everything, aspens green and creek running high. And she was from the first a child of profound stillness and observant attention who sat in the kitchen, while Fanny cooked and watched everything with large, serious eyes, and then commented on it with a precision that was clearly inherited from her father. Edwin, who had come into fatherhood late and with some uncertainty, had turned out to be the kind of father that the children measured themselves against and the neighbors spoke well of. He was patient and direct and honest with them, in the same way he was honest about everything, and he told them true things about the world in language they could understand, and he made time for them with the same deliberate attention he gave to things that mattered. He taught Samuel to track animals in the hills above the creek, and to read stars, and to be fair in his dealings with other people. He taught Clara to ride, and to handle tools, and later, to read with the same thoroughness he'd brought to his own Dickens and his Russian novelist with the unpronounceable name. The cattle operation became, over those years, a genuinely substantial concern. Fannie's plan for the 20-acre addition had been only the first expansion. By 1885, they had doubled the herd through careful breeding and made 2 more land acquisitions, and the Barrett-Redmond place was spoken of in the valley as one of the better-run operations in the county. Edwin took on the range detective work more selectively as the years went on, staying closer to home as the children grew, and eventually letting it go almost entirely in favor of the work on their own land, which had grown to be more than sufficient to occupy a man of his industry. One evening in 1885, 7 years after the spring Fannie had pulled a stranger from the creek, they were sitting on the wide front porch in the late summer evening, Samuel asleep inside and Clara still awake and moving around the yard with a lantern, hunting fireflies with the patient, methodical approach she brought to everything. Edwin was in the chair beside Fannie's, and they were both quiet, the companionable kind of quiet that 2 people build over years of shared life. The valley below was lit with the last of the sunset, the town of Crestline sending up a faint orange glow from its lamps, and the hills around them were going dark and soft, and the creek was making its low, steady sound in the background, the sound Fannie had lived with all her life and that Edwin had learned to sleep by as completely as she had. "Edwin," he said, "do you remember what you told me when you asked me to marry you?" He thought about it. "A number of things," he said. "I believe I said that riding away was one of the less intelligent things I had done in my life." "You did," she said. "You also said that you wanted to make something real and lasting and worth having." "I remember," he said. She looked out at the valley, at the girl in the yard with her lantern, at the hills going quietly dark. "I think we have done that," she said. Edwin reached over in the dark and found her hand, and held it the way he had held it on the porch the evening she had told him about Samuel, with that same firm and particular certainty, and he said, "Yes, Fannie, I believe we have." Clara came up onto the porch with her lantern, and the 3 fireflies she had convinced into a glass jar, and held them up for inspection with a gravity that suggested this was a significant scientific achievement, and both her parents looked at the small blinking lights in the jar and told her that it was. Edwin took the lantern from her when she climbed into his lap, which she still did with the unself-consciousness of a child who knows her welcome is secure, and Clara showed him the jar and explained her method of capturing fireflies, which was methodical and required patience, and Edwin listened with full attention and made observations that showed he took her seriously. Fannie watched them in the lamplight, her husband and her daughter, and then looked out at the aspens on the ridge, silvered by a rising moon, and felt the full settled warmth of a life that had turned out to be more than she had let herself plan for, back in those practical, self-contained years before a stranger had turned up in her creek and changed every expectation she had held. She had pulled him out of the water because it was the right thing to do, and because she was not a woman who left people in creeks. She had kept him alive because she was capable and stubborn, and possessed of a large heart that she had not, at that point, made any definite plans for. She had watched him ride away, and she had managed herself well about it mostly. And then he had come back, with the ring and the honest words and the steady, permanent intention, and everything after that had been the inevitable consequence of 2 people who were very well suited deciding not to waste any more time. The fireflies blinked in the jar. The creek moved in the dark. The moon came full above the ridge, big and clean and lighting the aspens so that they seemed to give off a quiet light of their own, that particular aspen light she had always loved. "Mama," said Clara from her father's lap, "do fireflies sleep?" "I expect they do," Fannie said. "Everything sleeps." "Even the creek?" "The creek rests a little in the dry months," Fanny said, "but mostly it keeps going." Clara considered this. "Then, can I keep the fireflies?" "Put them back before you go to bed," Fanny said. "They have their own night to live." Clara accepted this with the thoughtful seriousness she accepted most things, and Edwin looked at Fanny over their daughter's head in the lantern light. And the look was the kind of look that two people exchange when they are fully arrived in their life together. No arrival still ahead of them, no significant waiting left to do. It was a look she knew as well as she knew his hands, as well as she knew the sound of his voice saying her name, as well as she knew the creek behind the house and the aspens on the ridge and every other thing that was irreducibly, permanently hers. She had found him in the water. She had brought him back from the edge of something irreversible. She had watched him go, and then she had watched him come back, carrying a ring and something even more valuable than that, an honest intention, a real willingness, a specific and deliberate choice to build a life on these particular 40 acres with this particular woman, and to mean all of it fully. That was the whole of it. That was everything. And it was, as the man himself had said, more than either of them had known how to ask for. Samuel stirred inside the house and called out in his sleep, some dream speaking briefly and then letting go, and Fanny rose and went inside to check on him, pushing the door open quietly. He was asleep, turned on his side, one arm around the old stuffed horse his grandmother's letter had accompanied from Texas when he was 2. She stood and looked at him for a moment in the faint light from the doorway. This boy who had her stubbornness and his father's dark hair, and both their combined conviction that their opinions were worth expressing. When she came back out, Edwin had picked up the lantern and was holding the firefly jar while Clara carefully opened the lid and let the 3 small lights go back into the warm August dark, where they blinked and rose and joined the larger dark in the easy way of things that belonged to it. "There they go," Clara said softly, watching them. "There they go," Edwin agreed. Fanny settled back into her chair and Edwin settled back into his, and Clara climbed into her mother's lap this time, resting her head back against Fanny's shoulder, and the 3 of them sat in the warm dark of the August porch while the fireflies moved out through the yard, and the creek murmured in the hollow below, and the aspen stood silver and still on the ridge. In the morning the valley would ask for work again, and they would give it, because that was the nature of land and of the lives that belonged to it. There were cattle to feed and hay to cut, and a section of fence on the north boundary that Edwin had noted needed attention before fall. There was always something needing doing, and they would do it together, in the practical and unhurried and permanently committed way that had become the rhythm of their days. But tonight the porch was enough. Tonight the moon on the aspens and the creek in the dark and the sleeping boy inside and the drowsy girl against her shoulder and the man in the chair beside her were enough, were more than enough, were everything that the word enough had ever been intended to mean. Fannie Barrett Redmond looked up at the wide Colorado sky, just beginning to fill with stars in the deep blue of the late summer dark, and felt a gratitude so complete it had no room in it for anything else. No room for the old self-sufficient loneliness. No room for the careful management of feeling that a woman alone learns as a matter of survival. No room for anything except the full, certain, permanently inhabited present. In a creek bed, on a spring morning a lifetime ago and only 7 years past, everything had started with a decision to kneel in the mud and check a stranger's pulse. She would make that same decision every time. She knew it without question. She would make it every time, in every spring, in every life she was given to live, because it had led her here, and here was everything. The stars came out one by one over the San Juan hills, unhurried, each one appearing as stars do, as if they had always been there and the sky had only just remembered to turn down the lamp enough to show them. Clara was asleep against her shoulder. The creek talked on in the hollow. Edwin reached over in the dark for her hand and she gave it to him, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed saying, because some things are complete without words and stay that way, finally, permanently, and entirely.